esta computadora. Mike, go ahead.
What about the PowerPoint?
I'll run the PowerPoint, yeah?
I don't mind, but I need to see it.
You can run the PowerPoint on your computer?
Yes, I can do that.
Yes, try.
Yeah. I will do that. Yeah, I have it here.
You are the boss now. You can share your screen with us.
How do I do that?
There's in the middle of the screen is a green square. Down in the middle.
In the middle of the screen. No, I don't have a screen. Oh, that one. Share screen. Okay.
Share screen.
I click on that.
Yes.
Okay.
And then you click on your PowerPoint. Yes.
Can you see that? No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. You see the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yes.
The PowerPoint encounters an error and needs to quit. Huh.
I try again.
Yes. Not surrender. Never surrender.
Never surrender. I don't think it will go to full screen. I will try again, but we will see. PowerPoint show. Can you see that?
No.
Okay. I try again. Share screen. Can you see that?
Yes, yes, yes. Full screen.
You see it full screen, do you?
Yeah, yeah.
Is that okay?
For me, it's okay. Para ustedes,
you see it as one slide, or you see it with slides down on the left?
No, with the slides on the left.
So I see if I can make it go to bigger screen.
No, but it's okay.
Oh. It's okay?
It's okay. For me, it's okay. Para ustedes está bien también, ¿no?
Sí, está perfecto, se ve perfecto.
Sí,
You can see it now.
Much better. Much better.
Much better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Raúl,
Okay.
Sí.
So
Raúl,
you're on.
tenemos compañeras que piden ingresar, ¿puede ser?
Sí, estoy en eso. Lo que pasa es que, sí, ahí estamos. Tiene usted razón. Ya están adentro. Gracias, Florencia.
So you see and you hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I begin.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me, Raúl, and thank you for everyone coming today. The topic I have is to talk a little bit about Bourdieu and what he calls la misère du monde, which I translated as the poverty of experience. And what I want to do in this talk is to tell you a little bit about Bourdieu, to set a context, and also what we mean by social suffering, what he meant by social suffering. I would like to talk a little bit about who he was, and just to give you an idea of his philosophy. And then I have some examples. I would like to offer some introductory ideas of examples from different areas like agriculture and education and housing and economics, and try to talk a little bit about what he called the neoliberal state and its effects. And this will lead on to a little bit of discussion about the new rationality and reflexivity, and his ideas of what he called a new gaze, a new way of looking at something. So this is Pierre Bourdieu. His picture taken as a younger man, and I used it for the cover of one of my books. He was a French social philosopher who died about 20 years ago now. He had a very interesting biography. He was born in the mountains in France, in the southwest corner of France, and he didn't even speak French. But his mother pushed him, and he was very gifted academically, and he ended up going to the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, which is like the one of the highest schools, universities in France. All the great philosophers like Sartre and Derrida was in the same class as him, and he studied philosophy. This was what they call the royal route. In those days, he studied philosophy, and you know, the normal course then would be to go to university and to teach at the university. But in the 1950s, he went to Algeria to do his military service, and this was like a big shock to him. And he started to do a kind of anthropology of Algeria, and to try to understand what was happening in Algeria. And this involved him developing what I call a social philosophy. In other words, it was a philosophy, but an applied philosophy, shall we say. And all of the time, his studies became studies of practical situations and contexts. Now, he is sometimes called a sociologist, but his sociology is a very philosophical sociology. It's not always what we normally consider to be sociology. His is very much informed by philosophy, and I will say a little bit about that, because to understand Bourdieu, you have to understand a little bit of his philosophy, I think. He went on to become the Centre de Sociologie Européenne director in the 1960s, and then in 1980s, he was elected to the Collège de France, which is the highest level in France for intellectuals. There's only 52 people in the Collège de France. And when you get there, then you are the top of the academic tree. So his journey was a journey from kind of very poor beginnings to really very high intellectual and academic success. And he really was the last of that generation in the second half of the 20th century that included people like Foucault and Derrida and Lacan and all these people. So that's his background. I just wanted to say that he published a lot of books in a lot of different areas. His early work was in Algeria and also on agriculture in his hometown in the mountains. He went on in the 60s to do books on education and culture, photography. Later, he did big, what we call anthropologies of France in the 1980s, on, again, universities. He wrote books on philosophy and language. He gave books on methodology, and then a later part of his career, lots of different types of books on gender and literature and politics and art and painting and writing, and increasingly towards the last decade of his life, he became much more active. He was like what they call an intellectual engagé, very much took part in political activism, shall we say, used his ideas in a kind of political activism. In 1993, he published this book, which is called La Misère du Monde. It's a very big book. It's a series of what they call témoignages. It's what he did with his team. He went around France and interviewed lots of people, students, teachers, people working in factories, every type of person, a trade unionist, someone who makes wine. He interviewed lots of people about their lives. And the idea behind it, I think, was to show something about what it was to live in France at that time. I mean, this is almost 30 years old now. I was looking at it again to prepare this, and it's still very relevant, because it shows what people's everyday life is really like. And when this appeared in France, it was a big success. It was on television. This is a picture of France. This is what it's like to be French today. And even some of the interviews that they included, they acted them on the stage in the theater, as kind of vignettes of images of what it was to be French in the 1990s. And behind it was the idea of what neoliberalism had done to France at that time. Neoliberalism started in America and England more or less in the 1980s, but it was embraced by France as well. And what the neoliberal estate was amounting to in terms of the policy changes and how it was affecting individuals. And it is called Social Suffering, La Misère du Monde, the weight of the world in English. And at the beginning of this book, he makes a distinction between la grande et la petite misère. And what he meant by that was, la grande misère, where people are asking for money in the streets. He said at the time, well, more or less, we have solved this problem. I mean, now it's not true. In England, there are many people. This has come back. When I was a young adult, you never see people in the street asking for money. Now, if you go to London, all the time people would be asking you. And this is la grande misère, people with no money living in the roads, But his idea was there was something called la petite misère as well. And this picture by the artist Gillian Waring, the English artist Gillian Waring, is he went round and just got people to write what was going on in their minds. And this picture, I'm desperate. This man, he looks very correct. He has a suit and a tie, but inside he is feeling desperate. Now, why is he feeling desperate? What is this petite misère? What is his life experience that this is how he is feeling? So, the idea of social suffering behind this was not just the fact of lack of money, but it was a lack of life, of experience, of happiness in life. What was happening to people, that they were suffering, that their daily experience was of souffrance and not of contentment. So, this theme of social suffering, I think, is very important, and it has continued since then. I mean, this was 1993, but certainly in England and in many European countries, there's a high level of la petite misère in not just even before the COVID virus. There is this sense that something is going wrong within society, within economics, within the state, within the systems that are now used, and what has happened. How do we understand what has happened where this is the case? I wanted to just say a little bit about what we would call Bourdieu's epistemology. And for Bourdieu, you need to understand the idea of structure. This is not to say he was a structuralist, but looking at a situation, looking at a context, whatever it is, whether it's art, or music, or economics, or gender, or politics, he uses a structure analysis. And the structure is always the relationship between the subject and the object. You are the subject, the object of your gaze is the object. So there is always this issue of the relationship between the subject and the object. Now, you can say a lot about this. I mean, when you are a baby, you develop a cognitive experience with the world. You develop an experience with other people and objects and yourself even, and this is a structural relationship. So you're already beginning to think in terms of phenomenology and the type of relationships, structural relationships that you form with other things. I mean, for a lot of psychology or even Kantian philosophy, this is a kind of primary level of experience that you form relationships. But a lot of psychology and a lot of philosophy kind of thinks in this way without any sense of the value within it. And Bourdieu would see these structural relationships as already containing, dispositions, interests that kind of prejudice one thing or another, or a certain type of value that is high value or low value. And already when you are formed as a child, and then the world for Bourdieu is completely symbolic. Everything that you encounter in the world, people, objects, and even yourself, you have a valued relationship, a valued structural relationship within them. So you have this sense of a kind of phenomenological structural relationship, which is also psychological, emotional, social, all at the same time, if you like. So this is why structure for Bourdieu is very important, and I explained to you why it's important in understanding some of the things he said about poverty in a moment. So he talks at one point as breaking, Bourdieu epistemology. Epistemology is the science of knowledge. And he says, well, there's 4 types of knowledge. There's empirical knowledge. This is my everyday knowledge. I get up, I make coffee, etc. And I want to break with this everyday common sense, And then there is phenomenological knowledge. This is the philosophy of phenomenology and an interpretive science, which is known as a kind of subjective type of philosophy. I want to break from that. But then there's objective knowledge as well, scientific knowledge, and I want to break from that. So a lot of Bourdieu is very often talking about kind of ruptures and breaking and forming, like I said, a new way of looking at the world, a new gaze. So it's very important to see that, we're talking about, ways of knowing and questioning ways of knowing and questioning the way that we know things, that we know this, we know that. And within this epistemology, you question this, you interrogate this as a way of saying, well, is it so that I know something, but only from a particular point of view, And what is that point of view? And what's the alternatives? And this is quite a difficult thing to undertake because usually, we are very attached to our worldview and our point of view and whatever it is, whether it's our empirical view or whether it's our scientific view, we think we know who we are, we think we know what we know. And this kind of epistemology is kind of what I call corrosive. It kind of asks us to think through this and develop a different relationship to ourselves and the knowledge that we gain. So sometimes this is called like structural constructivism, and he uses this type of language that structures that are structuring and structured. In other words, when we encounter things in the world, they are structured, and it's when we absorb them, they become structured. In other words, we reproduce them, and you get this sort of language of the externalization of internality and the internalization of externality. So it's a kind of dialectic, that we are externalizing our own internality and internalizing that externality. So it's a kind of dialectic going on. So that's why he talks about what he's aiming for is a science of dialectical relations between objective structures and the subjective dispositions within which these structures are actualized. So it's a very dynamic sort of philosophy. It's something that's dialectical and dynamic, and something that tries to maintain something of the existential integrity or authenticity of the object of research. It's something that actually tries to keep that dynamic alive within the analysis. Bourdieu uses 2 thinking tools behind this epistemology. One is habitus and one is field. And both of them are kind of coterminous. They exist together. The habitus is the subjective. I come with my own background, my own biography, and it disposes me to be, interested and to act in one way or another. I have all these kind of schematas in my way of seeing the world, etc., etc. I have my empirical habitus. I might have my scientific habitus as a philosopher. All of these things are already built into my matrix, But then I enter something called a field. And for a field is an objective space of relationships. So, for example, what is a field? Well, education would be a field. We are in a field now. We are in an education field. If we go and work for the TV, then we are in the media field. Or if we go and work in economics, we're in the economic field. All of these are bounded spaces, and each of them have their own orthodoxies and ways of thinking. Now, he got this idea from the idea of field from Panowski, who wrote a book about Gothic architecture. And the idea behind this was that a certain way of thinking reproduced a certain style of architecture. And this is where Bourdieu got this idea of the field, that a particular way of thinking manifested itself in actions in the world, because we think that way, we act in that way. Yeah, and what Panowski was trying to do in this book was to show how a certain type of academic scholarly thinking led to the very style that we see in Gothic architecture. Now, what was that? In the book, he talks about, clarification, a certain order and logic, a way of a literary approach to something. All of this fed into the design of Gothic cathedrals, a certain way of doing things. And this is a good example that you can probe and explore, that actually, it's about a relationship. It's about the particular relationship that architects had to themselves, to the world, that then reproduced itself in their architecture. And I mean, this is, the power of thinking and the power of language. And the idea behind that is that whatever field we are in, it kind of predisposes us to think in a certain way with certain values and certain interests. And that feeds into the practice of what we do, what we decide is good and bad, and what to do and not to do. So the power of the field is very strong. So there's a kind of what we call ontological complicity. Ontology is a philosophy of being. And, what we're saying is that within a field, there is a moral force, whether you're in education or finance or medicine or whatever you're in, there's a kind of moral force that has its own ethos, its own kind of ethics, its own, way of, already you enter into a kind of orthodoxy of rationality. This is the way doctors think. This is the way lawyers think. This is the way teachers think, By entering the field, you are inducted into this way of thinking. And it's very powerful, because it also carries a certain interest, a certain advantage for that particular group. So you can imagine from Bourdieu's point of view, what he's trying to do is to break from that, to break from those orthodoxies, and to rethink and to reestablish different relationships to these things. Otherwise, we are just carrying on a conformity. We are reproducing a conformity, shall we say? But it's very difficult to do, because this is a moral force. It's a moral force, The orthodoxy is a moral force, and ontology is your very being, So really, what Bourdieu is trying to do is to replace these kind of orthodoxies with a more liberated epistemology, if you like. So this is a relational view of the world that he's talking about, So rather than seeing things as substantialist, as real in themselves, even something like a doctor, he would not see it as kind of doctor is doctor. He would want to see it as a field and a set of relationships, or lawyer. Again, what is a lawyer? Well, you define it, but that's not what exists in reality. What exists in reality is a set of relationships. And the way you go through it is a symbolic field. Everything is valued or not valued according to its position within the field. So this is, for Bourdieu, the symbolic power within fields. We all have symbolic power within fields according to our position. So if you're at the top of the field, you have a lot of symbolic power. If you're at the bottom, you have very little symbolic power. At one point, he uses the story of Patrick Süskind to give this put this idea across. The double bass player. It's a little play about the double bass player. He plays the double bass, and it's a very sad sort of play that the man plays in the orchestra. He says he's in love with his instrument, and he plays in the orchestra, and it's very important that he's in the orchestra. But bit by bit, you realize the way he's talking is that, his position in the orchestra is very inferior. He doesn't have the big parts, and, he talks, bit by bit, he talks about how the violinist doesn't talk to him because, the violinist is the lead player and he's just the double bass. And, this is another example of, Süskind is talking about, again, this suffering. The idea that you are kind of in a bind, you kind of like it, but you're trapped by it at the same time. And this life that this man has, you know, it's his life, but it's a life of inferior, and it's a life where his position in the orchestra, i.e. his position in the field, makes him in a very inferior position, and he's told what he can and cannot do, and who he can and cannot talk to, and all these sort of things. So Bourdieu calls this a double bind, if you like, that we get caught in these double binds, but we are at the same time attached to something, but we suffer from our position within which we are set within the social space. So there's a very good kind of literary example to kind of get the idea across that you know, our position within the field comes with consequences, you know. And of course, all the time we want to rise to the top, you know, so we play the game, you know, we get our capital and we play the game. And for Bourdieu, symbolic capital, well, there's three sorts. There's cultural capital, social or economic capital. Well, economic capital is straight money. Social capital is your social networks, and cultural capital is all of those, whether educational qualifications or, you know, the way you talk, the way you act, the things you own. All of this is cultural capital. And the idea for Bourdieu is that we define our position in the field in terms of the capital that we have, you know. So if you have a doctorate, it buys you a high position in the field. If you have a more inferior degree, then you are lower down in the field, you know, so then you have to use your social contacts and things like this. And the idea is that you can convert one form of capital into another, you know. So we're talking about a world for Bourdieu where we're talking about habitus, your individual biography and background, your professional habitus, and then the fields within which you exist, and the implications that has for, you know, to how you feel about it, you know. I mean, you know, whether this puts you in a position of double bind, of doing what you're told, of doing what you don't really want to do, etc., etc., etc. And this is where the social suffering comes into it. But why we still do it? Why? Because we want the economic capital. So the whole thing is convertible in the end to economic capital. So, you know, the idea is that you know, with the way things are, there's a degree of killing of spirit, shall we say, in the world today. You know, that the experience, everyday experience, can be quite poor. You know, and in the Misère du Monde, he describes the everyday experience of people. You know, they travel for 2 hours to get to work. When they get to work, nothing works, you know, and they work late, and then they travel 2 hours to get home. And you know, generally it's a struggle to be. It's a struggle to be. So bit by bit, there's a kind of killing of spirit. Now, he started this, he saw this right back in the 1950s in the Bayern, and started to analyze how one's position within the social space could lead to a certain degree of social suffering. And in the Bayern, he was at a Christmas party, and everyone was dancing, and he noticed in this picture that everyone was dancing, it was Christmas, but there was a group of men who were not dancing. And he asked himself, well, why are they not dancing? And he did many analyses and ethnography, and he discovered that the people that were not dancing were the men who literally could not get married, and they could not get married because of the inheritance laws. The inheritance laws of France meant that if there were two sons, that when the father died, they split the farm in two. And the families didn't want the farms to be fragmented and to be split. And so, you know, the eldest son inherited, and the younger son could not marry because he was just part of the farm. If he became married, he would want to split the farm. So by his very position within the social space, this led to him not having to be a bachelor. Le célibataire, le bal des célibataires is what they called it. So you got the idea here that a certain position within the social space could provoke suffering. You know, just by the position you are in would provoke suffering. You know, just because of the social, it wasn't about you, it was just the position that you occupied provoked suffering. So, you know, this started in the 1950s with observations. You know, Bourdieu was a photographer, and these were observations. And he did the same thing in Algeria, where you had the clash between in this picture, the traditional Algerian and the modern Algerian. And you know, this man with his shop on his bicycle, you know, he's kind of caught between two worlds. He's caught between the modern world and the traditional world. And in this space, he is nowhere. You know, he's not one or the other. He's not French, but he's not Algerian anymore. So this leads to a degree of anomie and a sense of insecurity and, you know, suffering and not knowing what he's doing and where he's going. And, you know, a lot of study, a lot of ethnography Bourdieu did about these kind of groups within Algeria to show how the social structures could lead to a certain degree of social suffering. So double binds is the story we're talking about here, about being pulled in different directions. And I just wanted to go through some examples like agriculture. And, you know, you can reflect on your own, you know, specialisms and backgrounds and things like this. But, you know, certainly within the French context and the English context, you know, you get these issues, you know, where modernization, a good idea, it sounds like a good idea, but the result is not good for the people that are involved, you know. So for example, in France, you know, you have the traditional peasant farming, which has been modernized, you know. So yeah, it's a good ideal, isn't it? It's modernized, but obviously this leads to many consequences, and you get caught in these awful situations where the father who owns the farm, you know, he wants to pass it on to his son, but his son perhaps doesn't want to stay and work with the farm, you know. So he's caught in the double bind of wanting to please his father and also wanting to leave, and you know, Bourdieu calls it, either way he kills his father. You know, he kills his father by staying and you know, becoming the leader of the farm, or he kills his father by leaving and abandoning the farm. You know, and again within ethnographies, Bourdieu shows how, you know, very often women are what he calls the Trojan horse of modernity with these peasant farmers. You know, the women leave early, they get in jobs in offices and things like that in the big towns, and then they come back and they marry the young men, and then they want to move to the town, and the young men move to the town, and then you get a rural exodus, and these farms are abandoned. And then they are bought up by commercial companies, big industrial, multi-international companies, and you get the situation like on the right, you know, where all of the traditions connected with the farming are destroyed, where it just becomes a factory farming, if you like. So all of those old traditions that were part of the French agricultural system are destroyed, and they create these big farms that, you know, the woods and the countryside are destroyed, and, you know, these firms they are really just they become employees of big agricultural industries, you know. So yeah, well, that's good, isn't it? That makes lots of money, and you know, it makes sense because it's, you know, more effective and more competitive, and maybe even the company that buys all this, it's not even French anymore, it's owned by the Chinese or something like this. So people are caught between two worlds, you know. They're caught between their traditional world and their traditional values and their traditional ways of life, and then, you know, this new world that's kind of imposed with its own internal logic of this is the way things need to be. They need to be super industrial and modern and things like that. And you know, the local markets break down, and everything becomes international and big, and they lose control, so it becomes very anonymous, you know, there's a degree of suffering in becoming this sort of anonymous factory worker in the countryside, in a way. In education, the same thing. You know, if we see education as a field in terms of principles and policy and outcomes, you see education changing over the decades, from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. It's a field that changes and has changed, you know. Bourdieu did a lot of books on education, like La Reproduction et les Héritiers, where he looked at the systems of education in France. And of course, what you got in France since the 1960s was a huge expansion in the student population. Well, is that a good thing? And, you know, the capital configurations that are attached to different types of education, different types of job, new institutions, new universities, more academic subjects on offer, demands of autogestion and participation. You know, you have a field that is changing. And so for Bourdieu, that would be a sense of restructuring, you know. In other words, the kind of structures of the field are being reconfigured and reshaped, you know, which means the academic, what is symbolically valued within the field, is also being reshaped. You know, so you have the traditional French university, the Sorbonne in Paris, you know, very traditional with the small lecture theatres and the old buildings and quite elitist. Well, obviously they want to open it out and make it more democratic. You know, 80% of young people must go to higher education, must go to university. But what you end up with is these mass lecture halls. You know, this is Nanterre University, thousands and thousands of students who never get to speak to the lecturers, very anonymous again, lots and lots of courses. More competition because there's more people, so there's more competition. So what starts off as a good idea, isn't it good that everyone goes to university, becomes a source of souffrance. It becomes a problematic source of daily experience. You end up, and in the Misère du Monde, he shows how people end up doing courses that lead nowhere. They spend years studying this. In the 60s, if you had a doctorat, the world was yours. You know, you could get a job anywhere. Now you have a doctorate, you work in McDonald's. You know, plenty of people with doctorates are working in McDonald's, you know. So, you know, what starts off as a good idea turns into something that is has lots of bad effects. So the academic field, the relationship to the state has changed because the state controls it much more. Universities are privatized. Universities are run according to kind of principles of economic corporatization. There is a struggle between what he calls temporal knowledge and scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is the academic knowledge, but the temporal knowledge is the knowledge of the university, the administration. You know, if you come into England, you know, if you go to any university, the administration gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the salaries of the people in administration gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the researchers, the academic, the scholars at the bottom become smaller and smaller and work more and more and more. So, you know, again, what you're seeing here is structural changes, topographic changes, shall we say, in the structure of the education field. Obviously, you know, the relationship, the state, the government pushes sciences, physics, chemistry, and all these subjects over the arts. So there's a lot of interference. There's no longer the you know, the academic freedom of universities, if you like. And also the academic fields are constantly put under quality audits, you know, surveillance. And because more people have certificates, you get qualification inflation. So as I said, many people, they have high-level qualifications, but they don't buy the same jobs that they would have done, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. You know, that more and more qualifications just means more competition, and so you get these kind of unacknowledged effects of what seem like good ideas, good policy ideas. Housing is another one in France, you know, where we can see that you know, the history of housing, lots of you know, structural changes in France. After the Second World War, they built lots of what you would call sort of state housing. You know, this was, in other words, it was built by the state. These apartments were built by the states. You know, they had new towns too, the philosophy of new town planning and things like that. Cities in the sky, the idea of cities in the sky and things like this. Now, again, you know, this is like the Gothic architecture. It comes with a certain way of thinking and a certain relationship to the problem, you know, and it sounds like a good idea. And of course, if you see the original models of these apartments, you know, there's lots of social space and sports space and gardens in between, you know, with flowers and trees. and then they build them, but then of course there's not enough money, and therefore after a while there are no more flowers, there are only bad, everything is in a mess, there's only paper in the flower beds, the lifts, the ascenseur going up and down, they don't break, they don't have any money to repair them, and so these kind of social housings become ghettos. The people with less and less money gravitate towards these social housing, and you get out, you leave if you can, but that in its sense creates a lot of social tension. And again, in Misère du Monde, he shows that. So, this was a state responsibility. And the state changes its relationship to this. So what happens is that the state, the government will say, okay, we take the money now and we prioritize the people that most need housing. We will prioritize them. Well, that sounds like a good idea, that we are going to prioritize the people that are the most poor. But what they've done is redefined completely their relationship to this. Originally, it was their responsibility to provide housing. Now, what they do is they've defined you as high priority, as poor. So they've redefined you, if you like. The state has redefined you, and by redefining you, they place you in a different position within the social space. And this is what Bourdieu is talking a lot about how, from the state, structural relationships are changed by policy. And you find that the status you have, the position, just gets moved somewhere else. You are no longer in the space that you think you are, because it's now defined as something completely different. And of course, what comes with it is a lot of social problems. You get people that have been living there for years and years and years, and then they put refugees and different people from different cultures in the apartments, and then the people, they don't like it because all they can do is the smell of foreign cooking every day is coming out the windows and things like that. And then this is the sort of environment where the kind of National Front, the fascist people take advantage of this. This is one of the reasons in Europe, that you get a rise of what you call the more extreme right, because they play on that. And then you get the guilt of the double bind, the guilt of these people. They sympathize with fascists and they see that, maybe even people, they travel from the left to the right very quickly, through their experience. And this is another form of souffrance. And of course, what happens, in some cases is that the state privatizes all of this anyway. Okay, we sell you your apartment, we can sell you your apartment. So you buy the apartment, that means the responsibility is yours now. It's not the state's to take care of the apartment. Well, that's okay for a few years. And then, I don't know, the person dies or moves on and they sell it. They sell the apartment to somebody else. And then you get kind of housing companies who buy them all up. And they buy up these apartments and then they rent them out. Well, who do they rent them out to? Well, people who've not got enough money to buy a house. So people move in that are very poor, but then they are very poor, so they don't have enough money to pay the rent. So where do they get the money from? Well, they ask the government and they ask the state to pay for them. This is like social security. So what you've in effect doing, you're moving kind of public assets to private companies. And this is what has happened a lot in England, that but in a strange way, you've sold public assets to private companies who then take those advantages and then ask for more money in support of those public assets, which they now own. So again, as I'm saying, it's a one of, all of the time they're changing relationships. Everything is privatized, everything is liberalized. In the moment in England, traditionally we had like a national health service, but bit by bit has been privatized. First the people who sweep the floor, that is privatized, and then the people who clean the toilets, that's privatized, and then the people that actually cook the food, well, that's privatized. So bit by bit it's privatized. So public assets are moved to private companies who then charge very high prices and do a very bad job. And so people complain that a very bad job is done, and so we privatize it even more. So yeah, let's privatize the whole thing. So you get these great confusions as to what's happening and the way people interpret what's happening. Culture itself, I mean, the consumption of culture. Bourdieu did a lot of work on culture and art and things like this, and he did work in the 60s on museums and photography, and this famous book in the 1980s, La Distinction, where he talked about, our cultural taste was shaped by our social provenance, but where we come in the social hierarchy, we like certain types of music, we eat certain types of food, we read certain types of literature, all because of our position within the social hierarchy, if you like. This was a kind of critique of Kantian aesthetics, if you like. And this is what he was arguing with this piece. And of course, it's very different from one country to the next. What would be so in Argentina is not what would be in France. It's not what would be in Germany, but it's the same principle. It's the same. We have different cultures, but the principle of distinction, all of our culture is not really culture. It's just a way of our distinguishing ourselves, and this is a picture of like the typical French bourgeois family, and this could never be England. This is very French with this Baroque style, and this is what they create. This is what is called the bourgeois sort of aesthetic world that traditionally would be the case. But of course, all of that has been destroyed in recent years. You end up with a kind of the internet and the kind of competitive view of the world. Everything is now kind of fed through social media. So competitions are no longer about just the performance. It's all about the judging of the performance, and everything has to be reduced to 17 syllables, the Twitter effect and things like this. So everything is kind of popularized to a point of sensuality, so it's like the lowest common denominator. So that, our very relationship to culture and aesthetics has been changed by social media and the way it is pumped out now. Through the media fields of globalization and commodification and massification and the homophilious targeting. And as we know, one of the side effects of this has been the rise of cyber corruption and fake news. The certain political groups have become very successful at manipulating and targeting. And this starts off just trying to sell records and just starting to sell books, but then it starts being used for politics and things like that, and a way of manipulating taste. I mean, years ago in the 60s, you released a record and then you hoped that it sold. In these days, this is not going to happen. If a big company like Universal Music is going to release one of your records, it's going to sell. They are going to make sure that they create the market in such a way that your record will sell. The market is much more controlled. Even someone like Henry Rollins, who's quite an avant-garde punk musician, sells his credibility. There he is selling Calvin Klein T-shirts. That everything has a price, and everybody has a price. This is what we're saying. It's like musicians now. You cannot make music by making a CD, a record, and selling it, because already it goes digital. So they have to find other ways of making money. So the structure of the market and the field has completely changed with Spotify and all this stuff. And it's to try to see the way that's changed and the way the capital within the field has changed, the social and the economic and the cultural capital, the symbolic capital, the way the field has been restructured, and in whose interest. At the end of the day, who is in control? I mean, in the Rules of Art, Bourdieu did a lot of work about literature and about the way avant-gardes are kind of manipulated now to, you're always looking for a new product, shall we say, So, by definition, if you are a new product, you're pretty soon old product, and you get displaced by the new avant-garde. And this is very much in the control of the media giants, shall we say. Now, what I was trying to do in setting this, I just talked for about another 5 or 10 minutes, but I mean, there are issues here about the way the modern state has evolved in the face of all this. I mean, Bourdieu at one time talks about, the way the modern state formed, from a position where you had the king and the court, the church and the judiciary, and how the way that evolved into a democracy, Democracy was one way of protecting the king, because if you were a king, you were in a very vulnerable position. You know, you tended to get killed very quickly, and the democracy was one way of actually protecting the ruler of a country. And what happened, what would have surrounded the king as the court and the church developed a bureaucracy and a judiciary. Yeah? But at the end of the day, the modern state still fulfills the same functional role, which is to be ultimately the source of legitimate violence. Legitimate violence. Yeah? I mean, this is a very important thing, you know. Legitimate violence. Only the state can go out and shoot you legitimately and claim they have a right to do it, you know. But also, you know, not only physical violence, the symbolic power. They have the right to define what is and is not, you know, what is not legitimate, acceptable. They have that power within a democratic system. Once they are elected, they have the power to do that. You know, we give them the power, you know. Through bureaucracy and law, it is multifaceted, but ultimately, if you trace it back, they have that power, and that's what happens, you know. And you end up with, you know, a kind of what Weber called a politically run economy. You know, it's run in a certain way according to certain interests and principles, you know, things like this. What I wanted to say is that what's happened in the modern state, there's a lot to do about rationality. You have to think about rationality and the type of rationality, the sorts of principles that are now used within the state. What I try to do in some of my examples is to show the way, you know, a certain way of thinking could restructure the world, you know, without you even noticing, whether it's education or whether it's housing or whatever it is, that a certain rationality restructures the world. And in that restructuring, you almost don't notice it. But your position is redefined, and your symbolic power, your symbolic value is redefined, and it does it by changing the relationship. And one of the things that has happened in the neoliberal world, if you like, is you get like two forces. On the one hand, the state is giving away its responsibility. We are not responsible anymore for education. We are not responsible for hospitals. We're not, you know, we everything is the people's responsibility. But so on the one hand, it's like this centrifugal and centripetal. On one hand, they're giving away power, but then they are concentrating power at the same time, and the power of control and the power of surveillance and the power of what you can and cannot do within the responsibility that is being given to you. So it operates in both ways. It's a very pernicious sort of development within the state where they have no responsibility, but they have ultimate control. I wanted to say that, you know, behind this, I was talking about neoliberalism, that there is a development and a change within economic relationships. Ultimately, you have to see this as economic relationships, and you know, in a traditional economy, it's structured in a certain way with you know, kind of relationships to time and honor and interest with a certain rationality. That is an economic situation in a traditional context, but that has changed. You know, and you have to see it from a position of a theory of capital. There's various theories of capital. You know, there's the capital in an economic sense, where really they are, you know, capital is just aspects of production. In a Marxist sense, capitalist is the basis of surplus value, and surplus value is always comes from exploitation of the labor capital. For Bourdieu, capital, there's symbolic economics, if you like, with Bourdieu. Yeah, I mean, the kind of classic and Marxist sense of capital is always that you know, it relates to kind of well, you know, economic relationships to the world, if you like. Usually the production of things, agricultural production, industrial production. But with Bourdieu, he sees an economy of symbolic exchange, if you like, that capital can also be exchanged, and surplus value and all these things in terms of just, you know, cultural assets that have value, in social assets that have value, that are translatable into economic capital. And of course, what's happened in recent worlds is this kind of high velocity of financial capital, you know, this kind of financialization of the world, if you like. And Thomas Piketty, in this book a few years ago, talked a lot about kind of capital and the nature of capital in the 21st century. And you know, what we get in a new economic field, which is kind of being played out in the context that I'm giving you, is that, you know, globalization, there's a new, there are new conditions of financialization, there are larger markets, and money itself changes at a much higher velocity. And the growth of the financial industries, like, you know, the hedge funds and the subprime loans and things like that. And what you find in these kind of economic fields, that any profit is now privatized and any cost is publicized. So the cost of these kind of economic changes are borne by the public, and the profits are taken by the private, you know. So you're getting this kind of you know, disparity between the private profit owners and the public cost bearers, if you like, in many economies. And this is what is causing a lot of the schisms, you know, in many countries of the world today. And it's completely in keeping with the theory of capital. I mean, you know, even Marx wrote about, you know, the nature of capital leading to concentration and accumulation. I mean, and that is what I see as happening in the world, you know, where more and more capital is being accumulated by fewer and fewer people. All of the evidence that Piketty gives suggests this is true. And this is completely consistent in the nature of capital. It leads to concentration and accumulation. So if someone is concentrating it and accumulating it, and, you know, whether this is Amazon or Google or Microsoft or Apple or whatever, you know, someone else is getting poorer and poorer and poorer, and the poorer and poorer and poorer are the masses, really. They are. Within that, you have a bureaucratic field that is trying to be neutral, trying to apply a certain rationality, trying to apply a normativity, if you like. The bureaucratic field is a kind of buffer between economic and social systems and the state, if you like. They are above, you know, they legitimize themselves by being above it. But actually, more and more and more, they are the mechanisms of delivering this type of system. Yeah. So you get a bureaucracy which is segmented and impersonal and disenchanted and contradictory and simplified and rigid and dehumanizing, and all of it is serving economic systems which have a particular type of capital ethic. They're kind of market driven with a high level of competition, where there is a huge tension between public and private spheres, and with the effect that the private sphere is gaining and the public spheres are suffering. I mean, this is the kind of thing that is happening very simplistically. I'm putting it very simplistically happening, but this is the kind of dynamism of what is happening within state bureaucracies. That the state, the bureaucracy is managing an economic system which, by its very definition and nature, is leading to a disparity between, you know, fewer and fewer individuals and more individuals, and you know, the kind of richesse and poverty, the differences that exist between the two of them. Again, Bourdieu talks about, you know, the domination effect, and nobody just dominates and nobody just monopolizes. What happens is that integration precedes domination, and this is what you're getting in the world: a kind of homogenization of, you know, everybody doing the same thing, whether it's kind of Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And by this kind of integration into these systems, the domination effect is a kind of side effect. You know, we don't start off saying we're going to dominate you, but by integrating you, we will dominate you. You know, we will control everything. You know, you probably have the sense, like I do, that Apple know everything about me. You know, they control everything about me. You know, and unifying system also leads to monopolization. And again, Apple is a good example of that. They have so unified their devices that they monopolize an area where it's very difficult to move outside. Once you're in Apple, it's very difficult to move outside if it's so. you know, this kind of domination monopolization political effect is all part of the kind of, you know, developments of the modern state and the modern economy, if you like. I pass over that one fastly. What I would say that I wanted to say a little bit about rationality, you know, that, you know, when I started off and was talking about a new way of looking at things, you have to get into a way of thinking about rationality itself. Well, you know, you might think logically and I might think logically. I'm asking you to think, you know, that logic is already interest laden, you know, you know, when you think something logically, already you're trapped by a certain rationality. What is that rationality, you know? And you can start unpicking it. So you, as an architect or as an economist or a political scientist or a teacher or an architect or a lawyer or whatever, you might think, you know, you might feel quite confident and quite stable about a certain way of thinking about things. But, you know, what one needs to think about the relational aspects of kind of cause and effect and you know, kind of process product and things like this. And, you know, I mean, there are ways of thinking about rationality, like instrumental and value-based rationality, you know. In an instrumental, what we try to do is you know, we try to kind of pull together the conditions to achieve a certain end. In a value-based rationality, we uphold certain values. Now those values might be neoliberal, or they might be religious, or they might be, you know, all sorts of values that we might think are, you know, are true. The values of the law, values of medicine, whatever, things like this. But those rationalities, you know, themselves imply different relationships. That's what I'm saying. You know, there are different ways of looking at problems. Whether you're looking at something as an instrumental view or as a value-based view, yeah. And what can happen is that when means that work conditionally are not legitimate and the ends that are permanently legitimate don't work, reason somehow is contaminated and unable to correlate behaviors and resolve conflict. Now, for me, you know, one of the major problems that we have at the moment is in the nature of rationality itself, in the nature of reasoning itself. You know, that things are put in a very kind of logical sort of way that you think, well, that must be true. But it's not necessarily true. It's not true. If it's just that it seems obviously true, but reason itself is the problem. You know, like in Brexit, you know, well, it's the people's choice. You know, well, it was the people's choice. Now, if you see that as the people's choice, you know, you don't see the full story of what is going on here, you know, and you know, what is really happening within this kind of field. If you just take that statement, you know, 1.7% people voted more for one side than the other, therefore it's the people's choice. Well, who are the people? The people don't exist, for a start, you know. And yet, you know, it's the people's choice. The people have decided, you know, the people, you know, the people. The people don't exist. What you have is a set of relations again, a social space, etc., etc., etc. So, but increasingly in the sort of media market field that I've been sort of presenting to you, you know, that sort of Twitter type view that everything can be reduced to, I mean, Trump is very good at doing this, reducing everything to a kind of an obvious statement, causes a lot of problems. Yeah. And what you do get is, you know, rationality becomes irrational. I mean, that's like some of these examples I'm telling you. It sounds like a good idea, is a rational idea that more people go to university or we build more houses or da 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 da. But what's happening is that there are irrational results. You know, the consequences of these actions are not seen through because they are only seen from a certain ethos, from a certain worldview, a certain way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking that is not objectified at the time. It's a way of thinking that seems obvious. Yeah. And what this system is trying to do from a Bourdieu perspective is to produce, as I say, a new way of looking at things and a new gaze on the world. And of course, this metanoia, this new way of this world, is this kind of teasing out the structural relationships and the values underpinning them, the generating principles underpinning them, and how those express themselves in terms of the interests within the field as a whole. And, you know, what Bourdieu is trying to do is develop a certain form of, you know, what he calls objective consciousness. Yeah. And to do that by objectifying you, me, as an objectifying subject. So, you know, the common biases with any field of knowledge is usually our space within the social field, the orthodoxy, the language of that field, and, you know, just our whole relationship to it because of it. You know, what he calls the scholastic fantasy. That these are three common biases. It's quite difficult to get people to, whoever you are, whether a sociologist, a philosopher, an economist, a lawyer, whatever, to accept biases. You know, people have a lot of investment in actually being legitimate and consecrated and true and justified. You know, so already this is actually asking everyone to think through the biases by holding a particular position within social space and the orthodoxy of the field within which you're involved. Yeah. And, you know, in order to deal with those, you reflect on yourself, the social space you're in, the fields you're in, the relationship with your field within the nation state. That all of these are structural relationships. You know, yourself, you are a mass of habitus-formed structural relationships within a social space which is structured according to symbolic capital forms. And to start building up a kind of topography of your kind of social environment, personal impression and professional, if you like. And to do that by looking at your particular resources. What capital do you have? Social, economic, cultural. What is your position within the field? What symbolic capital does that bring with it? You know, what recognition do you get from the public? Do you get any or none or a lot? What is the language of your field? You know, what is the language that you use? Yeah. What is the methodologies that you use? Yeah. What is the philosophy behind these methodologies? All of these are objectifiable in structural relational terms, is what I'm saying. Yeah. I mean, and Bourdieu calls this a participant objectivation. So can I objectify my connections, my connecting with the field of power? What is, you know, how does the field of power, bureaucracy and government affect my position within the field, within my field, you know? What is my relationship to the orthodoxy of my field, yeah, within my institution that I'm connected to, yeah? What are my aims? What are my positions? And then, you know, my habitus and the people that are around me within the field, you know, what backgrounds do we come from? What personal relationships do we form? What's the proximity between my position and other people's within the field? All of this is part of objectifying social space as a structural entity, if you like. So what you're trying to do in this sort of world, I mean, cutting to the final thing, is to produce a rationality that is not valued or instrumental, but is practical, you know, a practical rationality that is objective, universal, relational. And to move, therefore, I mean, Bourdieu talks about une politique de bonheur, you know, where, you know, the kind of policy, the politics, if you like, is not about, you know, making more money or being more efficient, but actually making people happier, more comfortable. You know, I mean, a little bit of the kind of climate, you know, issues on this are trying to do this type of thing. You know, try to rethink a different type of rationality. You know, so what you have is a big conflict of rationalities at the moment. But this again is what, you know, how you do this is obviously an enormous issue. But I'm just putting in these few minutes just to give you an idea of where all this is trying to lead. And where it's trying to lead is a different relationship to the world, a different way of viewing the world, a different way of thinking about it, a different relationship to yourself, to your professional life, to your social life, by objectifying and seeing the sort of social dynamics, the social forces that are acting upon you. I mean, in La Misère du Monde, at one point, he talks about it being almost like a kind of psychological therapy, you know, that you speak to a teacher, her life is terrible, you know, but actually she begins to objectify the social forces that are acting on her. And the type of methodology that Bourdieu is talking about is offering this type of, you know, this opportunity to have some epistemological, some tools that in some ways can you know, that you cannot change you cannot change the world. It's too big, but you can change your relationship and you can understand it. And by doing that, things change, you know. But that's the kind of vision that Bourdieu is kind of offering within his kind of his philosophy and his methodology. Anyway, I have a book of key concept on Bourdieu if people are interested in following this up. And I thank you very much for your patience in listening to this presentation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Raúl. Thank you.
Una pregunta al conjunto del público. ¿Ustedes qué prefieren? ¿Hacer un pequeño recreo o pasamos directamente a las preguntas y terminamos antes? ¿Qué es lo que ustedes preferirían hacer? El pueblo decide, ustedes el pueblo. ¿Ustedes prefieren un pequeño recreo? ¿Sí? ¿O terminar antes? Estamos en la oposición. Si les parece, yo prefiero seguir, me parece que va ganando seguir y terminar antes. Diría que sí, lo lamento a los que querían un pequeño recreo como yo, hemos perdido violentamente, hemos sido apabullados. Entonces, Mike, let's do some questions, yeah? Okay. And then we see.
Yeah.
Yep.
Can you see me? Can you see me now?
Yes. You are in the middle of the field.
Okay, cool. You don't need my PowerPoint anymore. No.
Yeah. No. Now we need you. You and your voice.
Thank you.
Well, questions? Se puede preguntar en castellano, si quieren, y hacemos una traducción de las preguntas. Sonamos.
Hicieron una pregunta
No la
por
vi.
el chat.
Perdón. No mire el chat. Es culpa mía. ¿Sí? Un mensaje nuevo. ¿Dónde está?
¿Me escuchás?
Sí, te escuchamos, Gonzalo. Dale, hacela en vivo.
Sí, si bien la hago en español, después la digo la misma en inglés. O sea, para decir gran parte de lo que estábamos hablando, justamente de lo que estaba hablando acá Mike, nosotros gran parte de estos puntos los vimos en otra materia que es sociología urbana, que es bastante parecido a los temas que habló Mike recién, con lo que nosotros vimos en esa materia, muy similar. También hablamos del proceso de financiarización, de mercantilización del uso del suelo, etc. Por eso mi pregunta iba más relativa a cómo se relaciona, digamos, estos procesos que Mike describe, o que describe Bourdieu, con las nuevas modalidades de uso del suelo que se están dando, digamos, a nivel mundo, ¿no? Porque de los años 50 al día de hoy, la forma en la que las ciudades distribuyen el suelo cambió. Cambió en el sentido de que antes hablaba de una ciudad quizás, por ejemplo, cuando hablamos de la Carta de Atenas, una ciudad mucho más dividida por zonas, zona comercial y unida por carreteras, y hoy de alguna forma no, se habla de la ciudad de usos mixtos, de una ciudad más vertical, más densa, pero también se habla de lo que es la densificación y lo que es la democratización del espacio, o sea, que vos tengas que depender de un auto, por ejemplo, para moverte, sino que puedas hacer todo a pie, de la ciudad a escala humana. Por eso quiero entender de qué forma se relaciona esto de lo que él habla, que también habíamos leído en el pasado, con las nuevas modalidades de uso del suelo. No sé si se entiende la pregunta. Ahí yo la puse en inglés.
Mike, can you read the question in the chat?
Okay. In the chat.
It's all right.
Yes, okay.
From Gonzo. No, I don't see it in the. Hang on. Yeah, okay. Gonzo, how can we relate these financial economic phenomena with the new land use modalities.
Yeah, the new cities, no cars, walking around the cities,
Yeah.
mixed uses, not that sort of great division between the town center, the neighborhoods, the offices, and the industrial, and that sort of a new way of mix all the uses in one town.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I did was very fast, and it's very good to take a specific topic like you're talking about here, a very specific topic, like the land use in the modalities, and to start building up, an analysis of this topic, the building up and seeing it as a field and a social space. And yes, you have these ideas and they sound good, like you have like new towns, where you have the division between work and living, and it all sounds great, doesn't it? It all sounds great, but there are several questions about, whose ideas are they, and who is paying these people for these ideas, and what is the relationship between the banks and the designers, the architects, and the politicians, I mean, I can tell you what is happened in France or Ireland or something like this, and what you see is a lot of interest between different areas that are not necessarily represented by the people that are going to live in these places, and lots of things are promised, like I said, that don't really happen. I mean, I don't wish to be too negative, but what I'm trying to say is that what you want to do is to build up, since your question is methodology, really, is what you want to build it up is this topic as a field topography, like who are the people in it, this field, what is their capital? What is their forms of capital? Where are they getting it from? What are the relationships between these different sites within the field and things like this? This is what we're talking about, And as I say, if you look at, say, like the new towns in France or something like that, there's a very specific, the architects come from one place, they have a certain way of thinking, they form part of companies that pay for certain money, the financialization comes from a certain direction. What happens, what's promised, and what really happens are two different things. I mean, you get quite a complete story about the structure of the space and the forms of capital that have symbolic value there. I mean, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to build up a structural space around this area in terms of the configurations of different forms of capital and which groups and which individuals hold it. Who are the architects? Where do they come from? Where were they trained? What were the ideas? All of this is behind these ideas which sound like you just said to me, oh, great, that the jobs and the people live in two different places and it all sounds fine and all that is good and There's something else, another story to be told there, because a lot of the times it goes wrong. It doesn't work very well for different reasons.
Mike, can I answer in Spanish?
Sure.
Yeah.
Go on.
Precisamente en esto que vos decís, Gonzalo, nosotros creo que una de las causas por las cuales cuando pasamos a tratar en el plano urbano ambiental la mixtura de usos, reconocer la ciudad tal cual era, y romper un poco la idea de la zonificación cruzada entre forma y usos, vino precisamente de la aplicación de estas ideas. Cuando vos te vas al campo concreto, empezás a ver cómo se dan las relaciones, empezás a entender que vos estás también contaminado por tu saber previo, y ves cómo se genera la interrelación en un aspecto concreto, empezás a descubrir que la situación anterior no es como funciona. Y por eso nuestra última influencia. El equipo Recu Boca desaparece de el consejo del plan y las distintas posiciones que fuimos tomando en la formulación del plan urbano ambiental que termina en el código de urbanismo actual. Vos vas a ver que nosotros hablamos de reconocer la ciudad consolidada, achicar la circulación, romper con la idea de la Carta de Atenas, reformar las normas de zonificación, pasar a los usos mixtos, independizar la forma del edificio global del uso, y un poco todo esto fue producto del análisis que nos llevó a deconstruir la situación existente sobre la base de la experiencia en el campo. Sorry, Mike, it was too difficult to translate for me.
For example, in London, all of the public space is being sold. And it is being sold to the Chinese. You walk along by the river, you think this is nice, you know, this is public space, but it is owned by the Chinese. And many of the parks now have big apartments, and they are all empty because they are millions of pounds each, and they are owned by Russians. It's the way of parking money, what we call parking money, you know, parking money, you know. So you know, there's the financialization of the space in London is very prescient, very critical, really, in the way that this has been operating. This has not been, you know, the construction of houses for English people. This has been the construction of investment opportunities for Middle Eastern and Russian millionaires.
Understood.
I have a question.
Oh.
I in English.
No, sí, coraje, vamos.
We have been talking a lot in this subject about the, I don't know the word in English, the regularization of the tenancy or the formalization of the tenancy. I'm thinking about the popular settlements in Latin America. I'm thinking about my experience in the Housing Institute of Buenos Aires. We had been working a lot, relocating families from this type of settlements to new buildings. This presentation made me think about the symbolic value of the deeds. Maybe you say deeds. For example, there are a lot of cases of people that doesn't pay attention or importance to the day that they have to sign this particular deeds, this formal paper, because for them, I think that they don't have a really value. They have been used, yes, they are used to live in...
Without papers.
So after that, this presentation also made me think about the sustainability of the regularization and when it's necessary to regularize some settlements or some informal ways of living, when it's not, and if the government decides to regularize it, maybe which will be the recommendation of Bourdieu or of you, Mike, thinking about all these processes.
Well, I think you get impoverishment, you know. I mean, in this move of public to private, this is the theory of capital, you know, the move from the public to the private. You know, what happens is that you know, the public private assets are moved to the private. Public assets are moved to the private, and then the public have no assets, none, but they still have to pay. They have to pay for their house, and they have to pay for their health, and they have to pay for, you know, and in the end, you know, the private take that as well, you know, and so they end up living in the streets. because they have nothing left, you know. So this is consistent with the theory of capital, that you know, accumulation and concentration. That is what is happening, you know. So jobs become more and more precarious. Jobs, more unemployment, more people they have nothing left. So in England, more and more people living in the streets, more and more people living in the streets, more and more people living with precarity, things like this, because you have this kind of, you know, basically what you have in England is, I don't know if you understand that, we call it asset stripping, you know, asset stripping, you know. It's like when you go somewhere and you take everything that's good, you know. What has happened in over, say, 40 years in England in a neoliberal state is that all of the things of the public have been taken, you know, the health, the education, the care, the universities, all of it has been taken from the public to the private, you know, and then sold back to the public by the private to the public. You know what I mean by that public. The public are people, the private are the financiers. So everything has been moved from the public to the private and then sold back to the public for a high price, whether it's rent on a house or education or health or something like that, you know. So, you know, the assets are moving, you know, first they take the assets and then they charge you for the assets that were yours, you know. And so you get the accumulation and concentration happening, you know. And so ultimately what you're having is a kind of crisis in capital and a crisis in symbolic capital, actually. I mean, this is the problem of Trump and Brexit and Johnson, you know, that there's a crisis in symbolic capital. You know, and it's not just money, economic capital, it's symbolic capital, you know, cultural capital, because your education doesn't buy you a job anymore. You know, and your social networks are destroyed, you know. So there's a crisis in symbolic capital. It's not just economic capital where there's this kind of accumulation. It's that the other aspects of symbolic capital are being destroyed. And therefore you get ghetto mentalities and people living in the streets and people just, you know, disaffected, living in the margins of society. Well, this is happening more and more and more and more and more. And so that they become, in England, they become very the target of, you know, right-wing political groups, you know. This is what happens, you know. They become very vulnerable to becoming racist and blaming, you know, refugees and immigrants and liberals and intellectuals and all these things. You know, it creates a very aggressive environment, as in Trump's America, England, you know, at the moment with Brexit and things like that. There's a lot of social tension because of this, you know. I mean, for me in Argentina, what I know of Argentina, what is destroying Argentina is the value of the dollar, you know. The dollar is destroying South America, you know. It's this kind of domination effect, you know, the integration, the monopolization, the unification, the domination, you know. The power of the dollar is destroying South America. The simplistic statement, but that's what I see, you know, all the time. Every time I come to Argentina, you know, the number of pesos to the dollar is getting, you know, yeah. This is the effect of capital, you know. It's like, you know, like again, it's like a black hole, you know. It sucks everything into it. It like sucks everything into it, you know. And if you're on the outside, you know, you're completely stripped, you know, like I say, asset stripped, you know. All these things are, you end up with nothing, you know. You have nothing. You have no symbolic capital, you have no cultural capital, you have no social capital. It's very dangerous. You understand? You understand, yeah.
Mike, can I?
Sí,
Sure.
Florencia.
Do you think that education is part of this kind of plan to monopolize and produce some kind of capital to have a kind of, how do you say, popular hand labor, always depending on people that accumulates the capital? Do you think that
it's a good
for
way.
example, this pandemic that shows a great gap in between the people that can afford internet to have, for example, this kind of classes and the ones that no.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, in England, you know, you have to have education, you know, I mean, at a certain age, if you know, you cannot be unemployed, you know, you have to have, you know, you have to go into education. So we have very high numbers of people going into higher education. But the problem is that, you know, very often they take qualifications that don't have any value, really. I mean, it occupies them for 3 or 4 years, but they don't really have any value. And even if you do, you know, it's very difficult to find an education that will, you know, give you a job, shall we say, unless you go to one of the elite universities, for sure. If you go to Oxford and Cambridge, then, you know, the reproduction of the elite is guaranteed by going to these places, you know. But then you get this kind of deception, you know, this idea that, and you know, for Bourdieu, it was quite right that after the Second World War, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, early 60s, you know, cultural capital, education, yes, was a way of you know, rising through the social class structure. You got a better job because you had an education. But as I said, because more and more people got this education, then you got qualification inflation. So the same qualifications no longer bought you a job. So then you have a crisis in cultural capital, you know? So qualifications are not enough, you know? I mean, having a doctorate is not enough. You need social capital as well. So, I mean, you end up with the basic kind of deception that, I mean, for Bourdieu, education was a means of the reproduction of the elite. You know, I mean, this is the paradox of democratic education. You know, it sounds like a good idea that we are all educated, but for him, you know, education was the you know, la noblesse d'état. You know, the reproduction of the noblesse d'état, the reproduction. And what happens is that reconversion strategies take place. So the elites still reproduce themselves. You know, so people from the working class get more educated, but the people here are also going up as well, you know. So why are you doing it, you know? I mean, why are you doing all this education, you know? And then, you know, coming into it is the whole internet thing where you think, well, you know, I can do it on my own anyway. I mean, the virus is causing this already. You know, people are, you know, already in our university, my university, all the buildings are empty at the moment, and everything is being done with a computer. So this is going to be the future now already. You know, we already have the systems in place. But then you have the question, why am I doing this? You know, why am I doing this education? You know, why am I, you know, if you are training for a particular vocation, then it gives you entree into a particular profession. If you're doing that, you know, you train as a doctor or something like that, it's still a field. You enter into a field, you know, it's a field, you know. But if you don't do that, you know, it is a debate as to why are you gaining this education? Why are you? And then in England now, you pay a lot of money. You know, you leave with you know, $70,000-$80,000 debt when you leave university. You know, I mean, so you leave owing a lot of money. So why are you doing it? You know, so again, there's a crisis in cultural capital as to why you are doing this, and how do you find a job? You know, and so yeah, you kind of disparity, you know, between two sides of it. Yes.
Can I interrupt a second? Sorry. So what's the way out? It's like a cycle that, how do you end this cycle? I was, like everything you said made a lot of sense to me, but on the other hand, I was thinking like, isn't like human nature this thing of having like double binds, or this thing of always being molded by our context?
Well, yeah, I mean,
how do you escape being molded your way of thinking by the context in which you are? Or it's
well,
like
I mean,
inevitable, right?
It's a good question, you know, it's a good question. And the problem, I mean, you know, when you get into this way of thinking, it can be quite depressing, you know, that you know, you see that whatever you do, it always is fatal, you know, fatalistic, you know, it can be quite depressing, you know. But I think, the first thing to say, at least know it, know what's happening, I mean, already to know it and to acknowledge it and to recognize that this is a problem is quite a big step, before you actually say, well, what should we do about it, I mean, just knowing about it and acknowledging, better to know it than to not know it, and then to look at some of the possible, solutions to it, maybe it gives you an insight into realizing that it's not as easy sometimes as it looks, okay, we have a problem, so we do this. You have to think it through in terms of what the likely effects are going to be in terms of the things we're talking about, so you're more informed by this, But there is a degree also of sort of, like everything in life, there is what we know, and then there's like reality, isn't there? We do our best with reality. There's always that. If whatever you're going to do, whether it's your
compromise.
Family, you have your ideals, and then you do your best. So it would be wrong to say there is no. It would be wrong to say there are easy solutions. But it makes you a little bit more suspicious of some of the easy solutions that are given. And it makes you to be more inquiring as to what's really going on in systems and whose interests they are really serving, and, where the fake news really is, and what are the at least and this is what I mean by changing a relationship to the world, and if you change, the people around you begin to change, so it's a bit of a bottom-up approach.
But how did this mechanism work before neoliberalism? Like the structure, the way of thinking of humans or of people was the same.
Oh, no. I mean, that's
I don't understand why is it a product of neoliberalism. I know, like, the system like makes it down to things in concrete, like the social housing or such things. But if it's our way of thinking, like before neoliberalism, how was it this, or how does Bourdieu thinks it worked?
Well, I think you're right that I mean, for Bourdieu, modern society, in many ways, like you're suggesting, behaves like traditional societies. You look at, anthropologies of South American or African Indians and things like that. You see these traditional societies. Actually, modern society works in a very, very similar way. I mean, acts all sorts of ways, as you say, human nature. You call it human nature. This is true up to a point. But there are choices. I mean, capitalism is only 200 years old, 250 years old. Neoliberalism is what, 50 years old. There are other ways of doing things. It doesn't have to be, quite so extreme as it is for a start. So you can do what you can do, and you don't have to privatize the hospitals. You can be careful about education and not turn them into corporations and with directors with very high salaries. The state. I mean, for Bourdieu, yes, it was a paradox. The state was the source of symbolic power, but the state was one of the great humanist. I mean, better the state than a king. Better the state than a dictator. Better the state. That this was one of the great gains of humanity, that we now had a state. But of course, you have a very strange definition of the state these days, as I said, which both, in terms of responsibility and control, is evolved in a certain way. I mean, in England, in the 1940s, the state took responsibility for citizenship. It doesn't take responsibility for citizenship anymore. As a result, citizenship is fragmenting in England. So these are deliberate decisions. I mean, they make a big difference. They make a big difference. These things. There are other ways of doing things. Now, with Bourdieu, like all philosophy, you have the ultimate analysis, and then you have the pragmatic analysis. And it's not to say the ultimate analysis is wrong, but the ultimate analysis informs the pragmatic analysis the best you can. At the end of the day, you do the best you can. And hopefully, the sort of methodology and the metanoia that I'm talking about allows you to make better pragmatic choices. So there are certainly things in England that were not a good idea. They were not a good idea. and they were done for the wrong reasons. And very often why they were done in England is because to lower taxes, you know. Everyone wants less tax, you know, what people want less tax. So you buy people's votes. So people come and they buy votes, you know. But then you're in crisis, you know. We are in crisis because we have 40 years of this. So we have no public services anymore because all the money has been given in taxes in order to buy votes, you know. At what point is there civil war, you know? It's very close. It's very close in some places of America. It's very close in England. In England, it's very divided with Brexit, you know, 50-50. It's very, you know, it's a form of you know, I mean, you know about this in South American countries, how citizens, it can break down, you know, it can fragment.
We have here.
Yeah.
Fragmented society.
Yeah. You know about this. Yeah, it can do it. I mean, and I know some of the problems in Argentina, and it's not easy. I know. I know that the traditions you have and the institutions you have to change anything is not easy, you know. But first, be clear yourself, you know. I mean, before you make big choices or decisions or declarations, be clear yourself about you know what's going on and where you are and within it. And that's what the Bourdieu kind of methodology gives you is an insight into, you know, the symbolic space and your position within it, and that already gives you something. You know? Then what you do with it is another question, you know. But you know, be clear about where you are and what's happening. You know, I've spent all my life in a university. Many things I don't agree with the university, but I can see them. You know, when I go to the university, I see it as a field. I see it as a structured space of symbolic forms. You know. And it does help me to negotiate politically through the field, you know, and to use the different things, you know. But I'm coming from an Enlightenment project, me. I'm not coming from a direction of exploitation, you know, because I have that philosophy, you know. I mean, so you know. So some people fool themselves, you know. They have kind of ideas, but the ideas are actually just egoism, you know. They're just self-serving, you know. You know, you have to work with the field, you know.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, I have a question. Correct me if I am wrong. You say that the new rationality is irrational, and we are like in a whole process of mercantilization of life. That the economic field is like above other fields, and it's like primacy. But also in the last few decades, we've seen the emergence of different movements that counteract this trend, like in a Polanyi sort of way, like indigenous movements that claims for the rights of the city, the ecological movements, the movements that claim for this new social capitalism. And how do you explain this emergence in this camp, in this field, and if you think that they are a new hope for this new rationality of happiness?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question, you know, because ultimately it's kind of resistance, you know. It's resistance, you know. I think I kind of live this, what you're talking about, you know, because there's an aspect of Bourdieu which is very pessimistic and very fatalistic, you know, that this is the way it is. And even if you change anything, strategies reassert, you know, the strategies move in such a way that it reasserts the same thing, it just looks different, you know. So, you know, there's an aspect of Bourdieu philosophy which is very fatalistic and very pessimistic, if you like, you know. And Bourdieu felt this himself, that the logic of his own analysis was very depressing, you know. But I mean, Bourdieu, I mean, increasingly in his life, became an actor of resistance, you know. And so he looked exactly to the sorts of movements that you're talking about as providing hope, shall we say, you know. but it is against his analysis, you know. I mean, okay, I mean, it's almost like Camus, you know, like Camus. If you're truthful about life, you would commit suicide, you know. But committing suicide is absurd. Therefore, I find a way of living, you know, a philosophy of living, because suicide is absurd. And Bourdieu is a bit like that, you know. You know, the conclusion of his analysis is true but absurd, and you have to. It's like I say about pragmatism. You have to have faith in the resistance, you know. Now, where you find that resistance, is an interesting question. And, you know, certainly for myself, I can just say for myself, I find it more useful to work with individual people, you know. I work with individual people, you know. With individual people, I can do something with an individual person, you know. But if I join a movement or a group, it's politics again, you know. The politics of the group, the politics of the movement, whether it's this movement or this movement or this movement, the politics are always the same, you know. The hierarchy, the symbolic capital, things like that. Some are better than others, you know. But it's always the same thing. What I find is that for me, it is a one-to-one basis. It's with the individual, and these individuals, I mean, I always call them like praxeological agents, you know. You send these agents out into the field with a certain way of viewing, you know, and these are influential people sometimes, you know. I mean, I work with people that they are influential people, and a little bit of this will actually animate the world that they're in, whether they're doctors or architects. A little bit will animate it, and that's the way I explain it to myself. That's my way of doing it, you know. Well, Bourdieu was more of a public figure. He was able to do things in the media because that's who he was. So you have to be realistic about who you are, where you are in the social space, and what you can do, you know. And what you can do in 20 years' time might be more, it might be less. But you know, at least what I was saying to the previous guy, you know, at least understand, you know, the space as a topography, as a structured space, as a space of symbolic positions, of valued positions within it, of strategies that are used by people within it. All of this enables you to navigate through this field and to see where you can influence it, to see where you can be of influence. It gives you the insight into these things. So it's very useful in that way, you know, to see it in that way. You know, it's not to say that, you know, oh, I'm a lawyer and I look at the field and, oh, it's terrible, therefore I have to stop being a lawyer. No, it's not. Obviously, that's not what I'm saying. It is to understand the dynamics of the field better so that you can be a praxeological agent, like I'm saying, a praxeological agent, you know, an agent of change, an agent of enlightenment. Now, how that is for you will be you. You know, it will be your story, but better to know, better to understand these things, you know, better having had a look at it. And the Mystère du Monde is worth looking at, you know. They're very short témoignages, witnesses. These people, you know, talk about their lives, and you begin to see how this way of viewing life can be, you know, even, you know, it's a liberation of sorts, and it's also gives a power of sorts, you know, and also a comfort of sorts, really. Otherwise, you're completely out of control. Wow. I have a photo of an umbrella.
Alguien que vuelve a entrar. Sí. ¿Alguna otra pregunta?
¿Puedo hacer una pregunta?
Sí, por supuesto, no estamos esperando.
Mike?
Yes.
Yes. What do you think about the process in the transport that is now leaving England, about the Crossrail project, and on the other hand, the statization of the lines? Like,
what do I think about it? I think that there are many. I mean, this is a good example, you know. I mean, this project has been around for a long time, you know, and the symbolic value of it is because the Prime Minister, you know, got many votes from working class areas, socialist areas that normally voted socialist in the north, and so he wants to show that he values them by giving them this railway that will go to the north, you know. So it's really a symbolic, completely symbolic act on his part, because everybody knows. People say, well, you know, you provide the rail line to the north and, you know, everyone will go to the north. That's not what will happen. What will happen is people will come from the north to London, you know, so it will actually increase London, you know.
Yeah.
This is the problem with these types of issues, you know. I mean, in France, they had a very definite policy of decentralization. You know, after the Second World War, we will put the chemical industry here, we will put the car industry here, we put the electronic in. They did this as part of the state plan in France, you know. In England, we kind of did the opposite. We destroyed everything, you know. We took away all our industry. In England, we have no manufacturing industry anymore. Nobody wants to take a fast train to Sunderland. And so the sense is, we call it a white elephant, you know, it's of no use, you know, it's very expensive, it's destroying a lot of the countryside, it's destroying a lot of the forests, but the Prime Minister, Johnson, wanted to give this, didn't want to be seen to be his first act, to be symbolically against the people that just voted for him, you know. So, you know, that's a very good example of exactly, you know, I mean, you would have to go into analysis. I mean, this is another lecture, but you would have to go into an analysis of the different factions, the different groups within the political party, because the Socialist Party and the Conservative Party is not like one party. It's a group, it's a series of groups. There's an internal struggle. It's like you have in Argentina, you know, you have internal struggles within the party. And actually, sometimes the struggles within the party are more important than the struggles between the parties, you know? And this is what has been going on in England, that you have a struggle within the Conservative Party that you know, have a particular philosophy and things like this. And Johnson is what we call an opportunist, you know? He doesn't have a commitment other than to be populaire, you know, to play this game, and he's been very successful, you know, like Trump. He's been very successful, but actually it has no rationale. Again, it's this rationality. It has no rationale other than, you know, just his own symbolic power, his own, you know, because he likes the power, you know. So, you know, if you look at sort of certain European countries, like say France and Germany, there is statist responsibility, even within a neoliberal, you know, there is, and citizenship, you know, societal citizenship between politics and economics and industry and things like that. That's not what has happened in England, you know. That's not what has happened, you know. You've had a completely breakdown of that relationship. So you have the kind of financiers and the money, you know, and then everything else has been destroyed. You know, the only thing we have is financial services here now. We have no industry in this country, you know? And Brexit will destroy the financial services. You know, so it's kind of a kind of economic suicide. So it's another, you know, it's another kind of crisis that is going on within the development of England, a post-colonial country. You know? I mean, it's you know, it is again the neoliberal rhetoric, the rhetoric of the neoliberal. You know, everything can be solved by the market. You know, everything can be solved by the market. You know? But the market destroys a lot of things as well. Yeah. Because ultimately in England, we don't have a tradition anymore of manufacturing or enterprise. We only have a tradition now of financialization. And within a modern world, most financialization is international, you know. All the money is, you know, it's not in England, it's within the international markets, you know, China, America. This is where the financial stuff is done. It's not done within the country anymore, you know. So you know, again, you have this kind of black hole, you know, sucking everything into it, you know, and no attempt to counteract it, you know. And the rail is a good example of that. It's you know, just a symbolic gesture of no real value, costing billions of pounds, you know. But then, you know, English people they're not very well educated, you know, politically. They're not very well educated. England is a very old country, you know, very, you know, it's not very politically aware or understanding, you know, compared to say many European countries. You know, you go to Spain, you go to Italy, people are much more politicized, you know. in England, we're not terribly political. Not been for a long time. It's the old class structure, with the Queen at the top of it and all this sort of stuff. I'm not being critical. It's the way it is. It's a very old, it's post-colonial, post-imperial, it's a post country. But it's also a country that's been asset stripped by a group of the ruling class.
Yo tengo una pregunta.
Avanti.
I know that Bourdieu also talked about like the legal field, like a place in which professionals can discuss the meaning of law, but not profanes or so I was interested to know if you find that there are legal reasons that explain urban inequalities or urban informalities, for instance. And in this sense, if you think so, if there is a way to find another law or another legal system that does not consolidate these urban inequalities, but can face them.
Well, yeah, I mean, the law is obviously always used to define relationships and to define people, and also the law is used, there's been a big kind of, I suppose the law was something that people thought supported them, the law was something that would support them, but now they tend to feel that it's something that moves against them, shall we say, that the law moves against them, that the interests that the law represents, or the tradition of the law is one of kind of, again, of neutrality, but that's not the case now, and what has happened is that a lot of the institutions that were on the side that mediated between the law and people have been removed, for example, legal aid, help, if you need legal aid, or all these sorts of things have been removed, And certainly there's kind of low-level law, where the regulations, this is the way things are done now. This is the way things have to be done now, So you get this kind of like, deprofessionalization of law, if you like, the deprofessionalization of law, and the kind of automatization of the law, whether it's like buying houses, selling houses, things like this, and people find time and time again that the law is always on the side of the other person, not on their side, in these financial kind of matters. It's always the kind of law for the one who has the power, not the one who's seeking equality, shall we say, And again, this has happened bit by bit, without people realizing that it is happening, but certainly, definitions of ownership, have made a big difference, like the way that people, many years ago, you could buy a house, the law, you could buy one house, you couldn't buy two houses or three houses. Well, now, liberalization, market, you can buy many houses. So this is what people do. They buy many houses, and then they rent it out to people, and they charge very high rents, but then the people cannot pay the rent. So then they have to go to the government and ask for money to pay their rent. So they do. So again, it's the way that kind of public money is passed to private ownership, by the change of the law that allows you now to buy all these houses, Tax is another one, ways of avoiding to pay tax. Again, it favors people. I mean, Google pay no tax in England, because they're allowed from the law to declare their tax outside of the country because they operate at an international level. So all of the time, the law is seen as being on the side of, the financial accumulators of capital, rather than, being on your side, the side of the people again, or the individual person, and these are quite deliberate choices that have been made, as well as I say, redefinitions of relationships, of who you are, and like, okay, so you know, you're 16, you know, okay, it's now the law that you must go to have education. You know, this is the authority that they changed the law. So all of the time, you know, the law is seen as a kind of legitimizer of the state. You know, the way of changing definitions of people. You know, are you homeless or are you sleeping rough? You know, just a definition like this. Legally, it makes a big difference if you are homeless or sleeping rough. You know, are you unemployed? You know, I mean, just these definitions that are all legally based now in terms of what your rights are on the basis of these definitions. You know, so what you're getting very often is a kind of a struggle for, you know, signifier, a struggle for definition. You know, which is a symbolic struggle. You know. Because it's a struggle of inclusion and an exclusion, you know. So these are the sorts of systems that have been happening within these, and it's not just the law, you know. I mean, a lot of social institutions, like say the police and the law and health, you know, these social institutions were there to protect you when you needed them, you know. And what people find is that when they have a crisis in life, they lose their job or something like this, they're no longer there. You know, when they contact them, what they get is an answer machine, you know, and they leave a message and no one phones back. And, you know, again, the distancing between it all becomes dehumanized and things like this, you know. So there's no sense any longer of law being something that's active and you know, something that concerns you, that will concern itself with you. It's something that confronts you and something that you know, will exclude you, you know, and performs on behalf of other people's interests, not the sense of the citizen's interest. You know, I mean, I'm no expert in law, but I know that this is what has been happening with these sorts of kind of systems of regulation and surveillance. You know, it really is systems of surveillance that the law operates in. You know? Yeah.
Yes, I do have a question also. When Bourdieu made his studies in the 90s, in the early 90s in France, it happens, I believe, that in that point of French history, maybe neoliberalization wasn't yet what it is now in France.
That's true.
But maybe people was already having like a symbolic crisis of the institutions and etc. And then that crisis made that afterwards neoliberalization could advance. So maybe it's about the crisis of the institutions that are built before, that allows, they are changed, and then neoliberalization can produce this grande souffrance, petite souffrance, etc.
Yes, I think you're right. I think you're right. Yes, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, I mean, you know, what Bourdieu offers is a set of tools, if you like, a way of looking at the world. I mean, the world is very different. I mean, Bourdieu died in 2003, whatever it was, and he. You know, I mean, he never had an email account, you know, I mean, the internet was only just beginning then, you know, we live in a very different way. I mean, his whole theory of field theory, you know, I mean, now if you were doing it, you'd have to look at internet fields, you know, that fields behave in a different way. You know, you have to adapt these ideas, you know, this philosophy to what's happening today. They were his ways, you know, of doing what he could for the period that he was active, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, you know. And yes, I mean, neoliberalism at that time of Misère du Monde in France was only about 10 years old. Well, now it's 30 years old. It moved on to something else. I mean, when I remember neoliberalism, it was all about the control of money, you know, the monetarism, we used to call it, monetarism, you know. I mean, the one thing that neoliberalism doesn't control is money now, you know, there's money everywhere, you know. I mean, there's a whole lecture again to talk about, you know, money and the form that money takes. I mean, is one of the interesting things, the way that, you know, the money, you know, has changed within these modern systems of the velocity, what I call the velocity of money, you know, the conversion of money and the conversion of capital, the conversion of cultural capitals and things like this, you know. So, you know, what I would say is, you know, the basic epistemology, the philosophy, the tools are of use, you know, they are use. But yes, I mean, the analyses that Bourdieu did, you know, within that time period is a different world from the one that we now have. I think a lot of the things are still, like you're saying, really an extension of these. But one of the things I think, going back to the previous questions, that we didn't see that has happened is that neoliberalism has eroded these institutions. Yeah, whether it's the, you know, health, medicine, or lawyers, or education, is eroded their you know, their position in the field. And I mean, you know, since the topic of this lecture was about social suffering, you know, ask yourself, you know, what are my double binds? You know, what are my contradictions? What are my, you know, what's my experience of daily life in terms of my double binds, of the paradoxes, of the space that I'm asked to occupy? And you know, that's what this type of thing allows you to, you know, and nobody has an easy life, you know, I mean, but it, you know, you begin to see how these contradictions are, you know, you're placed within these contradictions, and whether it's father and son, or husband and wife, or parents and children, or, you know, you and your job, or, you know, you where you live, you know, you're you know, there are these kind of social production of souffrance, what the French would call souffrance, you know, and it's to try to understand the source of that in terms of, you know, social structural position, and you know, the capital forms that are within it, and the logic of practice, and the interest. You know, these are the tools that give you, you know, ways of seeing what's beyond that souffrance, you know, rather than just suffering it. It's a very practical, you know, I mean, Bourdieu is a very practical sort of philosophy, you know. I mean, you have other writers like Foucault and Derrida and things like that, very fine philosophers, but Bourdieu is very active, you know. You can see it everywhere. I see it everywhere. You go into the street, you see, you know, symbolic, you know, you see it everywhere, you know. You go to the university, you see, okay, you know, this is, you see it as a field of symbolic positioning and capital forms, and people acting as if you know, this is reality. It's not reality. It's a chosen form of symbolic systems that are legitimized and consecrated and legitimized as such. It's not the truth. You know, it's just one that people buy into for advantage. I mean, we all do. But better to know that that's what you're doing it than to believe that it's reality.
Well,
like Bourdieu would say, the truth is at stake.
Mike, perhaps it's time to go, no? It's very late for you. Huh?
It is, what time is it for you? It's past...
For us, it's 32 past 9. Yeah. For you it's too late.
But, oh, this is rock and roll, you know.
This is rock and roll. One more question, or is enough? ¿Alguna pregunta más o es suficiente?
No. Quería hacer una pregunta respecto a. I have one more question, Mike.
Yes.
Is how. As we know, in 2008, it was the huge crisis of neoliberalism as we know. Like financial crisis in 2008 destroyed almost the most, or makes that everybody knows was about that the market wasn't regulated at itself. That was destroyed. Sorry. My question is about the wealth in the Occident as we knew, and this wealth going to East, like China, like you said before, like productivity, production, and labor is translating to China. And if this can explain a little bit about the behavior of states now about this selling stuff on to trying to achieve a short-term objective to maintain the way we used to live, and we are seeing like the decaying of this way to live. I don't know if I'm clear. Sorry for my English.
Well, I mean, you know, ultimately, I think I mean, I myself, you know, like you say, I lived this. I remember 2008, and for me, you know, really, I went back like when I was a student, and you know, started to read Marx again, and Marxian economics, and you know, the theory of capital and surplus value and the crisis in capital, you know, and you know, it all makes sense, you know, in a sense, you know, the one thing, Marx, when he wrote, he you know, he didn't see it as the international system that capitalism became. He just saw like England and, you know, some German countries, but, you know, capitalism kept, you know, rising to a higher level and a higher level, surplus value, surplus value, surplus value. And for me, you know, this whole thing that you're talking about since 2008, and especially now, is a crisis of capital. Actually, ultimately, it's capital. Capitalism is not that old, you know. But but the theory of it, in Marxian terms, is of one of increasing crisis. And what has happened is, what I suppose I was trying to say is that capital itself has fragmented into different forms. It's no longer just the traditional capital of labor, and now there's capital, symbolic capital, you know, cultural capital, but there's a crisis in all areas of capital now, you know, that the same. I mean, I did another lecture about this, you know, about capital conversion in postmodern economies, where, you know, the crisis in capitalism just doesn't affect money. It affects symbolic capital and cultural capital and social capital. You know, all these capital forms that Bourdieu talked about are in crisis, you know. And by definition, they are going to be in crisis because they're based on a system of surplus value. You know, I mean, what then happens? I mean, is a good question. You know, because you know what you see is that it's destroying the earth. You know, I mean, the final thing to destroy is the earth. You know, I mean, this is why you have the climate thing. You know. I mean, but you know, who wants to really change their life? Who wants, you know, everyone still wants electricity. They still want cars. They still want loads of, you know, we are operating at such an intense level. You know, this whole virus thing is a very interesting kind of introduction into the system. You know, because it's a big shock. And you know, I mean, this is what's happening in England. I mean, you in Argentina, you were very sharp. You know, you immediately close the country and quarantine, you know, because your economy is so fragile. You could not take a big hit, you know. But in England, I mean, you know, we delayed and we have many people dying and many people with it. And the economy now, you know, you cannot close the economy. I mean, you know, how are people going to live, you know? So introducing a virus into a system, an economic system, which is already in crisis, you know, just raises that. I mean, what is going to happen? We're talking about, you know, already you know, the 50% of the world being unemployed, you know, 50% of working for 30% of English economy collapsing, 30%, a third collapsing, you know, 20%, 20% unemployed in England, you know, when presently we got like 4%. You know, what is going to happen in that world? How are people going to live? How are people going to eat? At what point is there going to be civil war? You know, people start barbarism. You know, I mean, it's very alarming. You know, it is very alarming what the potential of all this is. But ultimately, I see it as a crisis of capitalism. You know, and yes, I mean, I do another lecture about 2008 and how, yeah, deregulation and what happened there. But you know, yes, that was certainly part of it, the deregulation, you know. I mean, but it was not just it was the attitude behind it, you know, that you could create this system out of nothing, that you could create capital. I call it anti-capital, you know. You could create profit out of debt, that it was all right, you know, that I could sell you debt, that you would buy debt, you know, and then you would sell debt, you know. And it's like, we call it like musical chairs, you know, this system going around faster and faster and faster and faster until someone we call it the blow the whistle, you know, and then the whole system collapses. And then people realize that you cannot let the banks collapse. And the banks knew you could not let them collapse. So we then give loads of money. So then they carry on playing the same game, you know? And then, as you said, you talk about China. And then, of course, China is another factor in the whole thing, who is already talking about having its own, you know, digital currency. This is what America's worried about the Chinese, you know, having a currency that will threaten the dollar. This is what the Americans are frightened of, you know? So it's another level of crisis within the capitalist system. And certainly, you know, the weaker your economy, the more you will suffer. You know? This is why Argentina, you know, suffers so much. Yeah, but yeah, you know, yeah, nobody wants pesos. Nobody wants to keep pesos. You know, you cannot. All my friends in Argentina, nobody wants pesos now. Yeah, I mean, it's not. You know, I mean, it's. Yeah, I wish I had some. I always end up like this. I wish I had a solution. You know? I wish I had something that I could offer you and say, you know, yes, you must do this. You know, wouldn't it be good? You know, I have the answer. You know, but I kind of, you know, honestly, I can only see it by what I'm saying. Really, is to start with yourself and your own position and the people you're with, and change your relationship to it, and work with it. And, you know, bit by bit, things will change. They have to. It's the only alternative, you know, because if you involve yourself in politics, you will become all like, you know, the only way to be, you know, like in England, you know, the only way to become the chief of the political party is to be as corrupt as the political party, you know, in England. So you're not going to become chief if you're not corrupt. So by definition, if you're chief, you're corrupt, you know. So if you want to do that, do it. If you don't want to do that, you have to find other ways of resistance. And there are many. And some of the, well, the other guys mentioned some of the things that you can do, but you have to be very careful, because many of the resistance movements are politics again, you know, with the same systems of internal structures and powers and things like this. You know, we're on a kind of crusade here. That's the word, crusade. That's it, Raul, crusade.
Okay. Okay. Well, Mike, it was a marvelous lecture. I'm very grateful about having you in this time in Buenos Aires, about this magic of quarantine and technology. So I hope you have enjoyed the lecture as much as we did, and we hope to get you another time, another day, and another opportunity, and perhaps we should go to Salzburg Hills once again. Yeah.
Yes. Why not? Good idea.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Thank you very much. Gracias a todos por la atención dispensada. Pequeña cosa, yo creo que esto puede ayudar para el trabajo final, sobre todo la metodología y esto de ubicar en el campo los distintos capitales para entender lo que pasa cuando vemos y poder mapearlo con más precisión. Así que espero que les haya sido útil. Nos vemos la próxima. Y just a little announcement, Mike. Ya tenemos fecha para la charla de ustedes, que sería el 1 de junio, en el horario habitual. Con lo cual, todos los que necesiten apoyo, tutorías, charlas, a completa disposición. Así podemos ir perfilando el trabajo, pues nos queda una sola charla, la del lunes que viene, más todo lo que podamos hacer por el camino. Así que muchísimas gracias a ustedes. Thanks a lot, Mike, and I'll see you. Yeah.
Who knows?
Someplace, someday.
We'll meet again.
We're going to meet you again. Yeah, we'll be together again with Bill Evans. Yeah. Bueno, gracias a todos. Que les vaya muy bien. Chao.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Chao.